Hello, this is our group. Jacob, Daniel, Ben, Cuff, Abby, Yumas, and Millie Curtis, and this is our AP World Imperialism, Germany, and Africa project. Here is our first quote, 6.1, and the context for this one is this source is coming from Nigerian statesman Nnamdi Benjamin Azikiwe, who was alive during European/German occupation of Africa. He is considered the father of Nigerian nationalism, which means he was alive during the German colonization of, Africa. And we can see with this quote that the interpreted German philosophy by the native Africans as they lived through the treatment that they endured as they were conquered, and it being related to Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection and the survival of the fittest, is key to understanding how they viewed their culture and racial identity as superior and a justification for their imperialization of Africa. 6.1. This is our second 6.1 slide. This image is that of an imperial German propaganda poster and a postcard referring to the established colonies in Africa. The text roughly translates to future visions for our colonies and depicts German men and women measuring and sizing African men, and then in the bottom right there proposes assimilation in the German culture as he's wearing a traditional German clothes and riding a horse. The propaganda depicting the ideal effects and envisioning of German colonization along with turning Africans into a more German person, in a sense, shows how the Germans viewed themselves as culturally superior, similar, if not identical, to the white man's burden, as enough justification for their forceful occupation of the Africas during the Industrial Age. This is two pieces of the same source, German photographer Walther Doberton's novel Litau Vorbeck Soldiers, a book of German fighting spirit and military honor. Generally, it's slight writing, but mainly an album of photos from the African front throughout the early 20th century. It aims to spread awareness about the conflict in Africa and also show the German army and people in a positive light. This photo album and film depicting African assimilation into the German military and behavior as seen with them wearing the traditional German military uniform, and description of the imperial military troops as having German fighting spirit and military honor is yet another indicator that the idea of German racial and/or cultural superiority is what gave them the idea that their imperialization of Africa was on just and moral terms.
Okay, 6.2. Initially, Germany imperialized with the policy of Realpolitik under Otto von Bismarck's command. Realpolitik is a system that puts the needs of the state before anything, and it is not based on beliefs, ethics, or morals, but realistic and practical ideas that should benefit the country as a whole. Using this policy, Germany expanded forcefully following Otto von Bismarck saying that iron blood is the way to make important changes to the state, iron being industrialization and blood obviously meaning the use of its military. This policy was used by Bismarck until he fell out of power in 1890. After Otto von Bismarck, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany adopted the policy of Weltpolitik in 1891, which aimed to obtain territories, create a large navy, and use aggressive diplomacy to transform Germany into a strong global power and into the spotlight. However, the problems caused politically by Weltpolitik was one of the causes for World War I, and consequently Germany lost the war and lost its colonies to the Allied powers.
So 6.3 was indigenous responses to the Germans. So Germany was actually able to colonize some areas of Africa without much resistance. This first image depicts some African slaves being captured by other Africans. When the Europeans came to Africa, they realized that they could quickly gain power in an area by becoming involved in the slave trade. And so this would give them access to some of the most powerful people in the African community. They would tell these people to capture slaves for them or become slaves themselves, and many Africans, in hopes of avoiding conflict, would agree to capture other Africans as slaves to sell to the Germans, and then the Germans would end up gaining control without much fighting. This quote is from an article, African Resistance to German Colonialism in East Africa, the case of Usukuma. And this quote, along with the second image here, shows that the treaties were made between the Germans and the African people. And this was another way in which Germany was able to colonize large portions of Africa without much fighting. This second part of 6.3 shows a little bit of a different perspective. This first quote is from a German in 1908, and it is from the perspective of a colonizer, obviously, but it demonstrates how many Africans resisted European colonization by escaping the labor they were forced into, not by military conflict. This caused a major labor shortage for the Germans and prevented the colonies from becoming extremely wealthy or powerful. Both the second and third quotes give some more examples of more aggressive resistance to German colonization. Often Christian leaders and religious spaces were the targets of these attacks, indicating that indigenous people did not accept this new religion and they were resistant to new cultures. This image to the right is actually a poster for a German play, we assume, which told the story of indigenous people raiding a German ship. Although this poster in this play probably made the African people appear more barbaric and uncivilized than they really were, it does still show that they were actively fighting back against the Europeans.
Okay, so this section is 6.4 Global Economic Developments. Sisal production was very important in colonial Tanzania. In the image to the left, you can see a sisal farm, and in the middle, you can see the effects of imperialism on the infrastructure of Tanzania, as you can see the trains. So the people in Tanzania grew and harvested sisal, as well as extracted the fibers from the plant, and then it would be transported to Germany either by railroad or boat. Sisal was used to make carpets, ropes, and more. And on the image on the right, you can see a factory that was used to make carpets and other textile stuff, I guess. After this, it would be transported to stores and it would be sold. So Hermann Gruson was a colonizer or an industrialist who created the, I guess it's called the Corona machine, and it was used to extract the sisal fibers from the plant. So he actually made a lot of money through this, and through his factories, he became very rich. He was from Magdeburg, Germany. He also was very interested in tropical and subtropical plants such as sisal, and he made a lot of money from his factories. So 6.5, the chart above depicts the GDP growth rates of European countries. In Germany, you can see during their imperialistic period from 1870 to 1913, their growth rate their GDP grew by 2.83, and then whenever they lost their colonies after World War I, it only grew by 0.3. So before the scramble for Africa, before and during the scramble for Africa, Germany economy was growing slower or growing faster than before they had any of the colonies. So this picture depicts the Herero genocide in Namibia. So they were a group of people who were an ethnic group in Namibia. And so anywhere from 24,000 to 100,000 Herero died. The German colonialism did not lead to prosperous times for all the people in the colonies, as they killed many of the people in the colonies. And this is not the only genocide seen by them at this time, so it was very detrimental to a lot of people in Africa. So a group called the Economic Committee of Germany invested 250,000 marks per year for the next 5 years in 1911. And they were using these colonies to gain materials for their industry and their heavy machinery. So they would get these, raw materials and send them back to their country to be used for heavy machinery. And so they were investing money in their colonies so that they could extract more raw materials for their industry. So this shows how they were, I guess, trying to use the colonies for raw materials and gain economically.
Okay, so for 6.6 and 6.7, this first image to the left depicts the baptism of a young royal girl. And you can see from the image that baptisms were a very important part of German culture. You can see that there's a lot of people gathered here for the event, and they're all dressed very nicely in a very fancy room. And so it's clear that the Germans valued Christianity and their religion, and probably believed that that made them superior to other people, which would lead them to believe that they had to save anyone who did not have the same beliefs as them, like white man's burden. To the right, you can see that the Industrial Revolution was also going on at this time. More and more Germans were becoming factory workers, and a few factory-owning families were becoming very wealthy, while the working class was barely surviving on the whole family's salaries. And so that would have led them to look for opportunities elsewhere. To the far left here, this is a very well-known political cartoon that depicts England, Germany, and Russia looking at the globe and picking out different areas that they want to colonize. This shows how imperialism became a sort of competition between different European countries who were racing to claim the most beneficial regions. This competitive nature would have pushed Germany to colonize as much African land as it could before anyone else did. This quote at the bottom also discusses this scramble for Africa, as it was beneficial for them to gain control of areas with a lot of people for labor and natural resources to take back to Germany and to aid with the Industrial Revolution. The Germans would have gone around the African coast in ships like the ones pictured here and settled in various locations along the coast. A tobacco merchant from Bremen, Franz Lutteritz, bought land in the area that then was called Southwest Africa, and then became known as Namibia in 1812. More and more German families moved to that area over the next few years, and this region became almost completely populated by Germans, but it still had a small indigenous population. It became an independent country in the mid-1900s and is still mostly inhabited by people of German descent. So this is the last 6.6 to 6.7 slide. This chart on the left shows the amount of imports to Germany by weight. And in the late 1880s, Germany was beginning to gain more control over different regions in Africa, and this gave them more resources that were sent back to Germany, as evident in the chart. And so those resources were often used to help push the Industrial Revolution forward more, because again, Germany was kind of competing with other European countries. Germany was able to subdue a lot of Africa through military force, and their military troops in Africa were called the Schutztruppe. These were led by Germans, but a lot of the actual fighting was done by indigenous people, which helped to lessen revolts because people would have been fighting against their own family. In the colony of Namibia, in 1904 to 1907, there was a genocide of the indigenous people by the Schutztruppe. This removed almost everyone that would have revolted against German rule.
This is our 6.8 slides. This shows a quote. The context for this quote is that it's an excerpt from an economics and politics writer and journalist with the Journal of Political Economy, and is about German corporations and their access to railway traffic and transportation services and information, essentially talking about the logistical distribution of consumer goods across both Germany and Europe, perhaps even farther depending on the specific company. And this is substantial evidence that consumer goods and more items were becoming more and more accessible to the everyday person, as we can see through this quote that details these corporations having large access to transportation systems across Europe, which is evidence of that being a side effect to the imperial age. This is another chart. Pause and read if you need to. It's quite sizable. In this chart, it's essentially displaying the average life expectancy of German citizens ranging from the years 1876 to 1910. After the full peak of industrial change has occurred and colonies have been settled by the Germans, we can see a sharp incline going further into the industrial timeline, with an increase in life expectancy by almost around 10 years total gained. This chart displaying these like life expectancies is evidence that due to longer livelihoods, corresponding almost directly with the increased amount of industrialization in Europe and specifically Germany, that the overall quality of life had increased by a large margin during the Industrial Revolution. And here is our works cited pages. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.